3 days after I gave birth, my mother-in-law laid a $25 million check on my hospital blanket and told me to choose. The room still smelled like antiseptic and warm plastic from the bassinets. My body felt like it had been taken apart and put back together by tired hands. Eden slept against my left side, Noelle against my right, both of them wrapped so tightly they looked like promises nobody had earned yet. Lenora Pike did not look at them like babies. She looked at them like assets. Behind her stood my husband, Callum, pale and quiet in the same navy coat he wore to board meetings. He had not held either girl for more than 2 minutes since they were born. Beside him was Tessa Rourke, Pike Haven's communications director, holding a diaper bag with gold zippers and 2 tiny blankets embroidered with the Pike name. She held it like she had already moved in. The lawyer placed a gray folder on my tray table. Divorce papers, a non-disclosure agreement, a temporary guardianship arrangement, written in language so soft it almost hit its teeth. Lenora uncapped her silver pen. The click sounded louder than the heart monitor. "Sign, Mara," she said. "You were never meant to raise Pike heirs." I looked at the check. I looked at Callum, waiting for even one flicker of shame. Nothing. Just the floor, his shoes, his silence. Then I looked at my daughters. Eden made a small sound in her sleep. Noelle opened one eye, dark and steady, as if she already knew the room was full of strangers. So I signed. Lenora's mouth relaxed. Tessa exhaled. Callum finally looked at me, relieved for all the wrong reasons. I capped the pen, handed it back, and lifted both my girls into my arms. "We're finished," I said. And we were. Just not the way they thought. Subscribe to the channel if you enjoy thought-provoking stories. Do you believe that silence doesn't mean weakness? If so, comment 1. If you think silence is defeat, comment 2. Today's story will give you a very different answer. I did not leave the hospital immediately. That was the part they never understood later. People like Lenora expected panic to look like motion. Running, crying, begging a nurse not to let them take the babies. But real panic has a quieter shape when you are 3 days postpartum, with 2 newborns against your chest and stitches pulling every time you breathe. So I waited. I let the lawyer collect his gray folder. I let Tessa pick up the diaper bag she had no right to carry. I let Callum follow his mother out of the room like a grown man being led by an invisible leash. The door clicked shut behind them, and for the first time in 20 minutes, the air belonged to me again. I looked down at Eden and Noelle. No one had bought them. No one had taken them. No one had even touched them. That was the first clean number. My doctor had cleared me earlier that afternoon, before Lenora ever walked in. By 6:40, the discharge papers were signed. Real papers. Hospital papers. The kind with nurses' names, times, instructions, and 2 infant bracelets matched to mine. There was no court order in my chart. No custody restriction, no judge's signature, no social worker telling me I could not leave with my own daughters. Just a tired mother, 2 babies, and a wheelchair beside the bed. Hollis Klein was waiting downstairs in the pickup lane, exactly where I had asked him to be. He was not there to rescue me from a locked room. There was no locked room. He was there because I was 3 days postpartum and too smart to drive. The nurse rolled me out under the white hospital lights. Hollis took one look at my face, one look at the girls, and opened the back door without asking a single question. "Which one first?" he said. "Eden," I told him. My hands barely worked as I buckled the car seat. Not from fear, from blood loss, sleep loss, milk coming in, and the kind of betrayal your body refuses to process until it knows the children are safe. Hollis checked the straps without correcting me. Then we did Noelle. We drove to Ardmore in silence. The apartment was small, furnished, and already paid for under my own name. A gray couch, a folding crib, 2 stacks of newborn diapers near the closet. Nothing beautiful. Everything necessary. I had leased it 6 weeks before my due date, because numbers had started moving in my marriage, and when numbers move without explanation, people are usually moving behind them. At 8:12 p.m., while the girls slept on a blanket on the floor, I opened my laptop. My hospital wristband dragged across the keyboard. That was when my hands finally shook. I wrote to Adelaide Brooks, my attorney. I attached scans of every page Lenora's lawyer had put in front of me. I described the check, the room, Tessa, Callum's silence, the timing, the pain medication, the fact that I was 3 days postpartum, when they asked me to sign away the two people still attached to me in every way that mattered. Chain of custody mattered in my work. That night, it mattered in my life. Then I drafted the revocation. Clear, dated, boring. Boring is useful when someone rich is trying to call you unstable. By morning, Lenora's lawyer would learn there was nowhere magical to file a hospital bed fantasy and turn it into motherhood. By morning, my registered letter would be moving through the system with a tracking number. By morning, they would understand that the paper they bought was not a cage. It was evidence. Lenora called at 10:17. Her voice had lost its polish. "Mara," she said, "let's be reasonable." I was sitting on the carpet between my daughters, still wearing compression socks, with $25 million in an account I had not touched, and 2 babies breathing softly beside my knee. "I am being reasonable," I said. "I'm keeping my daughters and the money you thought would buy them." Then I hung up before she could teach me another meaning of family. The first meaning of family I ever understood did not come from a mansion, a trust, or a last name carved into stone. It came from a nursing home hallway in Lancaster County when I was 17 years old, sitting beside my grandmother's room, watching a red call light blink for 43 minutes. I counted. Not because I was cold, because counting was the only thing I could do without crying. My grandmother, Celia Ellison, had raised 3 children, buried 1 husband, survived breast cancer, and still remembered everyone's birthday without writing it down. By then, her hands had started to tremble, and her left hip had never healed right after the fall. She was not helpless. That word always bothered me. She was still herself. She just needed people to show up when she pressed the button. That afternoon, nobody came. A nurse finally hurried in with apology written all over her face and exhaustion under both eyes. She was kind. That almost made it worse. The problem was not that she did not care. The problem was that caring had been scheduled out of her by people in offices who called understaffing efficiency and delayed care resource management. I did not have those words yet. I only had the hallway, the blinking light, and my grandmother's voice when she tried to make me feel better. "Don't fuss, Mara," she said. "They're busy." That sentence changed my life more than any graduation speech ever did. I went to college for accounting because I wanted to understand the language people used when they were doing harm politely. I learned balance sheets, reimbursements, Medicare billing, cost reports, and the quiet tricks hidden inside related party transactions. I learned that neglect rarely announces itself as cruelty. Sometimes it arrives as a missing aide on night shift, a therapy session billed but never given, a meal budget trimmed by someone who never has to eat it. By 29, I was working as a forensic CPA, the kind of woman companies hired when their books started whispering things their executives did not want, said out loud. I learned to preserve what other people hoped would disappear. People made jokes about that. Callum used to smile at dinner and call me the receipt girl, like accuracy was a cute little defect I had failed to outgrow. Lenora once laughed in front of 12 donors and said, "Mara is very useful when a caterer overcharges." Everyone smiled. I smiled too. Rich people love it when your intelligence is small enough to serve them. What none of them understood was simple. A receipt is just a memory nobody can deny, and the Pike family, for all their marble halls and charity speeches, had been leaving memories everywhere. I first saw how well the Pike family hid things the night Callum brought me to his mother's house. I had met him 8 months earlier at a healthcare compliance conference in Pittsburgh, in a ballroom with bad coffee and carpet the color of oatmeal. He was standing near the back after a panel on elder care reimbursements, smiling at something I had said about cost reports being more honest than executives. He laughed like he understood me. That was the first mistake I made with him. I mistook recognition for character. Callum Pike was easy in the way men are easy, when they have never had to force a door open for themselves. He had a soft voice, good shoes, and the kind of manners that made older women at hotel bars call him well-raised. He told me his family ran Pike Haven Communities, 47 senior living and nursing facilities across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. He said it with pride, but not ownership. Even then, some part of me noticed that. My mother turned it into what it is, he said. He did not say, we did. He did not say, I did. He said, my mother. I should have listened more carefully. The first time I walked into Pike House, Lenora's orange blossom perfume reached me before she did. The place sat outside Bryn Mawr, high on a hill behind iron gates, all pale stone and polished windows. Inside, everything looked inherited, even the things that were new. There was a portrait of Callum's father above the staircase, one hand resting on a leather chair, his eyes painted to follow you with the disappointed patience of dead money. Under the portrait, carved into a brass plaque, were the words Pike Haven used in every brochure, every gala invitation, every commercial with soft piano music. A century of care. Lenora Pike stood beneath it like she had personally invented mercy. She kissed the air beside my cheek, never touching skin, then looked at me from my shoes to my collarbone. Not rudely, efficiently, like she was appraising a donation item before deciding which table it belonged on. So, she said, you're the accountant, forensic CPA, I said. Her smile widened by 1 degree. How precise. That was Lenora's gift. She could make a compliment feel like a small locked room. Dinner was served at a table long enough to make intimacy impossible. Callum sat beside me but somehow still felt across the room. Lenora asked questions the way auditors ask questions when they already know what answer they want. Where was I from? Were my parents still living? Did I plan to keep working after marriage? Did I understand how public the Pike name could be? She never asked what I wanted, only whether I could fit. By dessert, she was talking about dignity in aging, faith-based service, and families trusting Pike Haven with their most vulnerable loved ones. The donors at the table nodded. Callum nodded. Everyone nodded at the right times. On a side table, beside the donor cards, I noticed a staffing report turned face down under a silver paperweight. I watched a server refill Lenora's wine with trembling hands, while Lenora kept speaking about dignity. That was the first number in that house that did not balance. Later, when Callum drove me home, he squeezed my knee and said, "She liked you." I looked out the window at the dark ribbon of road. "No," I said. "She measured me." He laughed because he thought I was joking. I wasn't. Pregnancy changed the way Lenora looked at me. Before the twins, I had been an inconvenience with a license number. A woman at the dinner table who knew too much about billing codes and not enough about pearls. After the ultrasound showed 2 heartbeats, Lenora stopped looking through me and started looking at my stomach. She called them the next Pike generation, before they had names. Not my babies. Not Callum's daughters. Not even her granddaughters. Pike generation. The first time she put her hand on my belly without asking, we were standing in the foyer under her dead husband's portrait. Her palm was cold through the wool of my dress. I stepped back. Only half an inch. Enough for her to notice. Her eyes lifted to mine, and for 1 second the smile disappeared. Then she laughed. "Hormones," she said. Everyone else laughed too, because in Pike House, laughter was often just obedience with better posture. Callum laughed the softest, which hurt the most. That was around the time his phone started turning face down on tables. He came home late with explanations that sounded prepared, but not practiced. Board dinners, vendor calls, emergency meetings. Once, at 11:30 at night, I heard him in the laundry room speaking, in a voice I had not heard since our first year married. Gentle, warm, unowned by me. A man's tenderness has a sound. You notice when it leaves the house. Then the money moved. $78,400 left our joint account on a Thursday morning, labeled consulting retainer. No vendor name. No invoice attached. Just 2 words clean enough to be dirty. I asked Callum about it over dinner. He did not look at me. He looked at the salmon on his plate. Company matter, he said. I do not believe plates. So I did what women like me do when a room starts lying politely. I made copies of what belonged in my own life first. Bank statements, mortgage documents, insurance policies, tax returns. Then I preserved the records Callum had already dragged into our shared study and mixed with household files, staffing summaries, therapy vendor invoices, foundation reimbursement schedules. Nothing hacked. Nothing stolen from a locked drawer. Just the paper trail of a man careless enough to bring company secrets home and arrogant enough to think his wife could not read them. I opened an account in my own name. I leased the Ardmore apartment. I packed 1 hospital bag for everyone to see and 1 plain black duffel I kept in the hall closet behind winter coats. I told myself it was caution. Then my water broke on a Tuesday morning, and Callum did not answer until the 3rd call. When he finally arrived, the girls were already here, 8 minutes apart, furious and perfect. I named them before anyone from Pike House could arrive. He kissed my forehead. He smelled faintly of the sharp floral perfume Tessa wore at every Pike event. That was when I understood Lenora did not want grandchildren. She wanted control with baby blankets wrapped around it. For 3 days after the twins were born, Pike House stayed away from the hospital, and that should have frightened me sooner than it did. Lenora was not a woman who gave space. She occupied it, she rearranged it, she named it after herself if no one stopped her. So when she did not appear on the 1st day, or the 2nd, I let myself believe motherhood had done something even money could not do. I thought maybe the sight of 2 tiny girls would soften the edges of that family. By the 3rd afternoon, I understood she had not been absent. She had been preparing. The nurse had just left, after checking Noelle's temperature, when the door opened without a knock. Lenora entered first in a cream coat, orange blossom perfume moving ahead of her like an announcement. Callum came behind her, clean-shaven, eyes low. Tessa followed with that polished little diaper bag, the one with gold zippers and 2 folded blankets visible at the top. Each blanket had Pike stitched across the corner in blue thread. Not Eden. Not Noelle. Pike. The lawyer introduced himself as Everett Shaw, though Lenora never looked at him when he spoke. That told me everything about his place in the room. He was not there to advise her. He was there to make her will look formatted. He laid the papers out on my tray table in careful stacks. Divorce, settlement, confidentiality, temporary guardianship. Each tab was a different color, like they had reduced the end of my marriage and the removal of my children to office supplies. Everett cleared his throat and began using words people use when they want cruelty to sound civilized. Transitional stability, voluntary arrangement, protection from unnecessary conflict, best interests of the minors. He said minors because babies would have made the room too honest. Lenora sat on the edge of my bed without asking. The mattress dipped, pulling at my stitches. I held Eden closer. Noelle made a small, hungry sound, and Tessa actually stepped forward, like instinct had confused her for someone with rights. I looked at her hand. She stopped. Lenora smiled as if I had been rude. "This does not need to become ugly," she said. "You can leave wealthy, Mara. You can recover. Start over somewhere quiet. Or, you can force us to explain to a court why a woman who documents everything, who sees fraud in every grocery receipt, who is already hiding money before delivery, may not be emotionally suited to raise Pike heirs." Callum flinched at the word hiding. Not because it was false. Because he knew why I had done it. I waited for him to speak. To say my name. To say our daughters' names. To say anything that belonged to the man I thought I married. He adjusted his cuff. That was his testimony. Lenora slid the check toward me with 2 fingers. $25 million, she said. More mercy than most women in your position ever see. My position. A hospital bed. 2 infants. A faithless husband. A rich woman trying to rename theft as mercy. I felt milk leak warm through the front of my gown. I felt the IV tape pulling at the back of my hand. I felt every part of my body reminding me that I was supposed to be resting, healing, learning the weight of my daughters. Instead, I was reading a contract. So I read it. Not as a wife. Not as a daughter-in-law. As the woman they forgot I was. There was no judge, no hearing, no sworn statement, no independent counsel for me, no witness who was not already paid by Lenora Pike. Just pressure dressed in legal font. Everett placed the pen near my fingers. Lenora leaned close enough for her perfume to cover the antiseptic. "Sign," she said, "and let the girls have the life they were born for." I looked down at Eden and Noelle, both breathing against me, both already more real than every legacy in that room. Then I picked up the pen. I signed my name slowly. Not because I was weak. Because people relax when they think they are watching you surrender. The pen felt too heavy for something so small. Lenora watched the tip move across the line with the hunger of a woman watching a vault open. Tessa looked at the babies instead of me, and that told me exactly how far she had let herself dream. Callum kept his eyes on the floor, as if my signature had made the room safer for him. I wrote Mara Ellison Pike for the last time. Then I set the pen down. Everett reached for the papers too quickly. I placed one hand over the folder before he could take it and looked at him until he remembered himself. "Copies," I said. He blinked. "Excuse me? Copies of everything I signed." Lenora's smile thinned. "That won't be necessary. It will be for my records." The word records did something small to the room, not enough for them to understand. Enough for me to feel it. A little shift. A little warning none of them knew how to read. Everett made the copies at the nurse's station because refusing would have looked worse than agreeing. That was the thing about people who live on appearances. They can be cornered by manners. When he came back, I took the folder, slid it into the side pocket of my hospital bag, and lifted Eden first. Then Noelle. My body protested so sharply that for 1 second the walls blurred at the edges. I did not let my knees bend. Pain is information. It is not instruction. Lenora stood. "Mara," she said, softer now, almost pleased. "You're making the right choice." I looked at her then, really looked. At the pearls, the coat, the calm face of a woman who thought a check could turn motherhood into a transaction. "No," I said. "I'm making a record of yours." She did not understand. That was fine. Understanding could come later. The hallway outside my room was bright and ordinary. A nurse laughed somewhere near the desk. A cart rolled by with dinner trays under plastic lids. Life continued in small, practical sounds, the way it always does around private disasters. I did not run. Running makes people chase you. I moved like a woman being discharged with her children, because that was what I was. Every bracelet matched. Every instruction sheet had my name. Every nurse who saw me saw a mother leaving with her newborn daughters. Not a fugitive, not a thief, not the ruined woman Lenora had already begun drafting in her head. By the time the elevator doors closed, Eden was asleep against my chest. Noelle stared upward, wide awake. I looked down at her and finally let myself breathe. Calm was not surrender. Calm was inventory. And I had just carried the most important evidence out of that room in both arms. The next morning, after Lenora's call, I met Adelaide Brooks in a brick office building 2 blocks from Rittenhouse Square, with formula stains on my sleeve and milk leaking through a sweater I had owned since graduate school. I had slept 41 minutes. Eden had cried every time Noelle stopped. Noelle had watched the ceiling like she was auditing the apartment for structural weakness. Adelaide did not offer comfort first. That was why I trusted her. She was 54, silver-haired, narrow-eyed, and dressed in the kind of black suit that made expensive men sit up straighter. She read every page I had brought her while I sat across the table, with both girls asleep in their carriers by my feet. She did not gasp at the check. She did not widen her eyes at Lenora's name. She did not call me brave, which I appreciated, because brave is a word people use when they are safely outside the fire. She finished the last page, set it down, and looked at me over the top of her glasses. "This is trash," she said. For the first time since the hospital, I almost smiled. "Legal trash?" I asked. Expensive trash. She tapped the guardianship agreement with one short fingernail. Signed 3 days postpartum, in a hospital room, with your husband's girlfriend present. Under threat of financial destruction, without independent counsel, without judicial review, and without any meaningful custody process. It is not nothing, because rich people can make anything noisy. But it is not what they told you it was. I looked down at Eden. Her tiny mouth twitched in sleep. So they can't just take them. No, Adelaide said. Not just, not cleanly. Not because Lenora Pike wrote herself a fairy tale in legal font. The breath that left me did not feel like relief. It felt like a bill coming due later. Adelaide saw that too. But listen carefully, she said. Can we beat this? Yes. Can they still drag you through hearings, evaluations, emergency motions, custody experts, character attacks, and 3 years of financial bleeding before they lose? Also yes. There it was. The real room behind the room. Lenora did not need to be right. She only needed to be funded. Adelaide leaned back. They will try to make you look cold, calculating, unstable. A woman who took money and ran. A woman obsessed with documents. A woman who planned too much before giving birth. I looked at the sleeping carriers. I did plan. Good, she said. Planning is not a crime. But they will try to make it sound like one. Outside her window, traffic moved along the wet street. People with umbrellas, delivery trucks. A city continuing as if my daughters were not balanced on the edge of a rich woman's patience. I asked the question that had been forming since Lenora's voice cracked on the phone. What do they actually fight with? Adelaide did not hesitate. Money. Not love. Not truth. Not even the law. Not really. Money. On the drive back to Ardmore, Hollis at the wheel, that word sat in my lap, heavier than both car seats combined. The custody fight was the visible thing. The courtroom. The petitions. The signatures. But the engine underneath it was Pike Haven Communities. 47 facilities. Thousands of residents. Donor galas. Government reimbursements. Family trusts fed by a company wrapped in the language of care. I had been asking the wrong question. It was not, how do I keep my daughters away from Lenora? It was, what keeps Lenora powerful enough to reach for them? By the time we pulled up to the apartment, both girls were asleep. Hollis turned off the car and waited. I said it out loud, mostly to hear whether it sounded as cold as it felt. I don't need to beat her in every room. Hollis looked at me. I need to find the room her money comes from. And somewhere in the quiet, under 2 sleeping babies and 1 ruined marriage, the next calculation began. That night, after Hollis left, and the apartment finally went still, I opened Pike Haven the way I opened every company that smelled wrong. Not from the top. From the bottom. Executives lie in summaries. The truth usually gets tired and shows up in footnotes, staffing tables, reimbursement schedules, and invoices no one thinks a daughter-in-law will ever read. I made coffee, I forgot to drink, set Eden and Noelle's bassinets beside the desk, and pulled every public record I could reach without touching anything I had no right to touch. Inspection reports, ownership filings, Medicare cost reports, Medicaid reimbursement summaries, vendor payments, related party leases, staffing disclosures, foundation grants, complaint histories. At first, Pike Haven looked beautiful. That was the problem. 47 facilities across 3 states, and somehow the staffing ratios repeated with the neatness of a hymn. Therapy hours rose at the end of every quarter, like someone had trained old bodies to need care on schedule. Memory care consulting fees moved through a vendor called Northstar Wellness Strategies, a company with a website full of stock photos and no employees I could find. Facility improvement grants left the Pike Haven Foundation, traveled through 2 management companies, and landed back near Pike Family Real Estate. Not proof yet. Just shape. Fraud has a silhouette before it has a face. I worked in pieces because newborns do not care about financial crime. Eden woke hungry. Noelle woke offended that Eden had woken first. I fed them, changed them, hummed badly, then returned to the desk with 1 baby against my shoulder and a spreadsheet glowing blue in the dark. By the 3rd week, the clean numbers had started to rot. One facility in Scranton reported full overnight staffing during a week when state complaints described residents waiting hours for help. A center outside Youngstown billed group therapy sessions on days when weather reports showed roads closed under ice. 3 homes in West Virginia charged for wound care supplies in quantities that made no human sense unless someone had mistaken frailty for inventory. Then I found Marisol Vega. Her name appeared in an old internal email Callum had printed and left folded inside a tax folder. She was a nurse manager at Pike Haven Maple Ridge. Her message was short, careful, and terrified. She had warned that night shifts were dangerously understaffed and that therapy minutes were being corrected after the fact. Her supervisor had replied with one sentence, "Please, align your language with company reporting standards." I read that sentence 3 times. Then I found Marisol's number. She answered on the 4th ring, voice low, as if the walls had ears. "Mrs. Pike?" she asked. "No," I said. "My name is Mara Ellison." Silence. Then she said, "I wondered when someone would finally read the reports." Marisol did not give me a confession. People imagine whistleblowers bursting open doors with boxes of proof and shaking hands. That is not how frightened people sound when they have rent, health insurance, and a husband on dialysis. Marisol Vega spoke in careful pieces, each sentence tested before she let it leave her mouth. She told me Maple Ridge was always short at night. She told me therapy minutes were adjusted after therapists went home. She told me wound care supplies were logged in quantities nobody on the floor ever saw. She told me residents were not beaten, not starved in any dramatic way that would make a headline easy. They were delayed, ignored, rescheduled, rushed through care by aides assigned to too many rooms, and then blamed when the paperwork did not match the brochure. "They don't hurt people loudly," she said. "They just make it impossible to care for them properly, then bill as if you did." I wrote that down after we hung up. Not in the report, not yet. In my notebook? Because some sentences are not evidence, but they are why evidence matters. For 2 days, I let myself think about using the easier weapon. Callum had made that simple. Hotel charges, late-night messages, a jewelry receipt that did not belong to me. Tessa's perfume on his collar and her name tucked into vendor emails like she was both mistress and marketing strategy. I could have sent the file to every board member, every donor, every woman in Lenora's church circle who had ever smiled at me like pity was a social skill. It would have felt good, for about 10 minutes, then Lenora would have survived it. Wealthy families do not collapse from affairs. They absorb them, they rename them. They call them private pain and move the money somewhere quieter. The affair was not the building. It was wallpaper over the rot. So I closed that folder and went back to the numbers. When Hollis came over the following Saturday, Eden was asleep in a sling against my chest, and Noelle was making angry little sounds from the bouncer. My kitchen table was covered in cost reports, inspection histories, reimbursement summaries, and colored tabs. Hollis stood there for a long moment, taking in the mess. Then he smiled once. "Revenge looks boring when it's done right," he said. He sat across from me and read for nearly an hour without speaking. That was another reason I trusted him. Men who need to perform intelligence talk too early. Hollis waited until the papers had finished talking first. "You built a trail," he said finally. "I built questions." "No," he said, tapping the schedule where North Star Wellness appeared for the 6th time. "Questions are what you ask when you want answers. This is what you build when you already know someone is lying and you want the right people to prove it." He would not write the complaint for me. He was careful about that. Clean lines mattered. But he showed me where the lines were. State health departments, Medicaid fraud control units, HHS, Office of Inspector General, licensing boards, the agencies that did not care about Pike manners, Pike donors, Pike perfume, or Pike threats. "Do not send anger," Hollis said. "Send something they can reproduce." So I did. I spent the next 3 weeks making the report clean enough to survive people who wanted me dirty. Every source cited. Every assumption explained. Every number tied back to a public filing, a reimbursement record, a staffing disclosure, or a document Callum had left in our shared life. I paid an independent healthcare billing consultant to review my methodology. I paid for data I could have guessed at, because guesses are where rich defendants like to hide. At night, when the girls slept, I worked under the blue light of the laptop and reminded myself what this was not. It was not a tantrum. It was not revenge for a cheating husband. It was not a mother-in-law story anymore. It was a map of how a family had learned to turn old age into revenue and call it care. When I finally submitted the complaint, I did not cry. I did not shake. I uploaded the report through the official portal, mailed hard copies by certified mail, saved the receipts, and watched the confirmation number appear on the screen. Then I wrote it down. Because Lenora had been right about one thing. I was the receipt girl. 19 days after I filed the complaint, Lenora invited me to a gala. The email came through Callum first, because cowards prefer messengers. He wrote that his mother wanted a private conversation before the evening began. Something civil, something for the girls. The event was called A Century of Care, held in the ballroom of a Philadelphia hotel with chandeliers low enough to make everyone look expensive. I almost did not go. Then Hollis said, "Sometimes the record walks into the room without you. Sometimes it helps to be sitting where everyone can see your face." So I went. I wore a plain navy dress and flats, because revenge is easier when your shoes do not hurt. Eden and Noelle stayed with Adelaide's sitter. I carried no folder, no printed report, no dramatic envelope. The part that mattered had already left my hands weeks earlier with tracking numbers and confirmation receipts. The ballroom smelled like lilies, champagne, and Lenora's orange blossom perfume. Donors stood in clusters beneath banners showing smiling residents, soft blankets, hands held by caregivers in perfect lighting. Near the front, several actual residents sat in wheelchairs, dressed carefully, their families beside them. One woman clutched a folder of billing statements against her chest. That was who I looked at. Not Lenora. Lenora stood on stage in ivory silk, pearls at her throat, speaking about dignity, tradition, and trust. Behind her, the Pike Haven logo glowed gold against a blue screen. "Families come to us," she said, "because they know we keep our promises." The side doors opened before she reached the next sentence. Two people entered first. A woman in a dark suit with a federal badge clipped to her jacket, and a man carrying a banker's box sealed with red evidence tape. Behind them came two state officials and a court-appointed receiver I recognized from the name on a filing Adelaide had shown me that morning. No one shouted. That made it worse. The woman stepped to the microphone and introduced herself in a flat, official voice. Pike Haven Communities was under expanded investigation for billing irregularities, staffing misrepresentation, and suspected misuse of Medicaid and Medicare reimbursements. Certain accounts were frozen. Selected facilities were being placed under independent oversight effective immediately. The room went silent in the way rooms do when money suddenly feels mortal. Lenora's face did not collapse all at once. It cracked in stages. Her eyes found me. "You," she said. I stood slowly. She pointed across the ballroom, past donors, residents, board members, and cameras already turning. "This is her, my son's wife. She did this." I walked to the front without hurrying. "No," I said. "You did this." Her mouth tightened. "You called me the receipt girl," I said. "So I kept every receipt." A man in the front row rose with help from his cane. His voice shook. "Is my wife safe there tonight?" For the first time, Lenora had no answer. So I gave him the only honest one. "She is safer tonight than she was yesterday," I said, "because now someone outside that family is reading the books." After that night, Pike Haven did not fall like a building in a movie. It fell the way dishonest things usually fall in real life. File by file, account by account, signature by signature. The receiver took control of the worst facilities first. Administrators who had spent years speaking in polished phrases suddenly had to explain missing staff, inflated therapy hours, and payments that traveled through companies with names nobody on the floor had ever heard. Some managers resigned before anyone asked them to. Others stayed long enough to learn that loyalty to Lenora Pike did not count as a defense. Callum was called in twice before he called me. I let it go to voicemail. His message was 47 seconds long. He said he missed the girls. He said things had gotten complicated. He said his mother had pushed him into decisions he did not fully understand. He did not say he was sorry. He still thought innocence was something you could borrow from a stronger woman and return when the room got dangerous. Tessa disappeared before spring. Someone told me she took a communications job with a hospital network in Florida. That sounded right. She had always loved good lighting, clean logos, and men who looked solvent from a distance. Lenora lasted longer. Women like her do. She called the investigation political. She called the receiver overreaching. She called me unstable, ungrateful, vindictive, but she said all of it from outside the company her name used to command. That was the difference. For the first time in her adult life, people listened politely and then checked the documents anyway. The custody hearing came later, in a real courtroom with bad carpet and a judge who did not care about Pike House, Pike donors, or Pike heirs. Adelaide stood beside me. Eden and Noelle stayed home with Hollis, and a bottle warmer that made more reliable noises than most men I had known. The hospital papers never became what Lenora paid for them to become. A judge saw the timing, the pressure, the witnesses, the lack of process, and the two babies who had never spent one night away from me. Callum's attorney talked about legacy. The judge talked about children. That was when I knew we were safe. The settlement remained separate. I kept what I had chosen to keep, and I used part of it to start a legal fund for families with loved ones in long-term care who could not afford to ask the first question. Not because I became noble, because I knew what silence costs when nobody keeps the receipt. In June, I took Eden and Noelle to Maple Ridge after the new director invited Marisol back as nursing supervisor. The hallway smelled like coffee and clean sheets, not orange blossom. A call light blinked near room 214. Before I could count past 12, an aide answered it. Marisol saw me watching. "Better," she said. I looked down at my daughters sleeping in their double stroller, their last names stitched on a small blanket my grandmother would have loved. Lenora called them Pike heirs. The court called them children. I called them Eden and Noelle. And that was the only accounting that ever mattered. The lesson Mara learned was not that every family deserves forgiveness. Some families use that word the way Lenora used legal papers. They fold it neatly, dress it in tradition, and hand it to the person they hurt as if pain becomes holy when it is carried quietly. But love is not ownership. Blood is not permission. Money is not morality. And a last name, no matter how old or polished, does not give anyone the right to decide who you are allowed to be. For a long time, Mara thought being calm meant surviving in silence. She thought if she stayed useful, polite, and careful, the people around her would eventually see her value. But some people do not overlook your worth by accident. They ignore it because acknowledging it would weaken their control. That is why the quietest people are often the most underestimated. They are not empty. They are recording. Every insult, every lie, every moment when someone chooses power over love. And one day, when the time is right, they stop explaining themselves and simply let the truth stand up. This story is not only about revenge, it is about recovery. It is about a mother who was broken open in the most vulnerable moment of her life and still found the strength to protect her children, her name, and the strangers no one rich enough had bothered to protect. Real strength does not always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like getting the babies buckled into the car seats. Sometimes it looks like saving the receipt. Sometimes it looks like choosing not to become cruel, even after cruelty has given you every excuse. And maybe that is the deepest lesson here. Family is not the people who claim you when you are useful. Family is the people who protect you when you are weak. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments. Which moment hit you the hardest? Was it the hospital room, the courtroom, or the moment Mara finally said, "I kept every receipt"? And if you believe quiet people can still change the ending, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who needs to remember their worth.